presented by The Day and Connecticut College. I am Izaskun Larran, managing editor at The Day, and will be moderating today's event. The heinous death of George Floyd at the hands of 4 Minneapolis police officers on May 25th, 2020, forced us as individuals and as a nation to face inequality and racism head on. It forced us to take a look at policing and demanded we acknowledge that Blacks, Latinos, and other minorities are disproportionately targets of police brutality. Movements like Black Lives Matter have been clamoring for police reform. So why now? Other men and women have been targets of police brutality. Racism, discrimination, and inequality have always existed. But Floyd's death did something. I can't quite explain it, but it shined a light on what no longer can be ignored. And cities across the nation, including New London, decided to take a look at how they police. Several months ago, New London Mayor Michael Passero directed a diverse group of community members to review relevant policies and practices of the New London Police Department and make pertinent recommendations. Today's panelists include Debo Adegbile, Connecticut College Class of 91, law partner at WilmerHale and Connecticut College Trustee. Ronald Davis, former director of the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services under the Obama administration. Mr. Adegbile and Mr. Davis worked together with the U.S. Mayor's Conference to produce an extensive report on police reform and racial justice that was released this past summer. We are also joined today by Efrai Dominguez, President, New London City Council. Tamara Lanier, Vice President of New London NAACP. John McKnight, Dean of Institutional Equity and Inclusion at Connecticut College. Jeannie Milstein, Director of Human Services, City of New London. Maya Shepard, Organizing Director, Hearing Youth Voices. And Captain Brian Wright, New London Police Department. These conversations are necessary. They're not easy. So let's get uncomfortable. Mr. Adegbile and Mr. Davis, can you tell us a little bit about yourselves? And then tell us why you think it's critical to reset the relationship between police officers and the people they serve. Mr. Adegbile, please go first.
Of course. Well, it's great to be with all of you. I'm sorry that I can't be live in New London, and I look forward to the opportunity to be back with you in a city that I love and has given so much to me. I, as you have mentioned, am a law partner at the WilmerHale law firm and a U.S. Civil Rights Commissioner, and I have worked on these issues for a number of years, policing issues and equity issues. I used to be the director of litigation at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and in my work at Wilmer, I have represented the Baltimore Police Department in the city of Baltimore and assisted the city of Chicago in negotiating consent decrees following the very public incidents in both cities with respect to the killing of Freddie Gray and Laquan McDonald. So I've seen these issues from both sides. I've worked on the cases as a civil rights lawyer. I've worked on the cases as a lawyer trying to find a resolution through processes involving the Justice Department. And I've worked closely on these issues with Ron Davis, who is my friend and brother, who has done such great work in so many police departments across the country. Today, I'm here speaking to you in my own behalf and not speaking for my client, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, but of course, that report is public and intended to inform these conversations nationwide. It's great to be here with you.
Mr. Davis?
So good evening, and let me start by thanking you for the invitation to participate and for everyone attending. My background is probably unique in that it's about 35 years now of law enforcement. So my father was a cop. I became a cop in 1985 in the beautiful city of Oakland, spent 20 years there, became a police chief for about 8 years in the city of East Palo Alto. And then I went to this Obama administration to be the director of the COPS office, we call it, which is community policing. But what probably, you said reset the relationship. I'm going to rephrase that. How about we need to set a relationship, because it never was established to begin with. And so I come at a perspective of three different perspectives I like to share with people. One is someone who spent 30 years in the field, and I'm proud of those years. I'm proud of what law enforcement can do, and often we do. But I'm also a Black man and a father of Black children. Mm-hmm. So despite being a police chief, I have to have the same talk with my son and daughter before I give them the car keys like anyone else. And I still am subject to being stopped if I'm not wearing a badge and a gun at the time that I'm getting stopped. And I have been stopped. And so I understand those perspectives. And I think these kind of conversations force us to be truthful about what it means. And so as a Black man, I have concerns. As a Black father of Black children, I have concerns. And as a cop who knows that a lot of cops are trying to do the right thing, I have concerns. And so that's what brings me here, is the idea that any conversation we can have, these tough conversations, are very necessary. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. This question is for both the panelists. I think I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the insurrection that happened at the Capitol 3 weeks ago. In the United States Conference of Mayors report on police reform and racial justice, there is a section on addressing protest and the critical role of police in protecting the constitutional rights of freedom of speech and assembly, and how police should be trained to recognize the difference between peaceful protests and civil unrest. Can you briefly address the frustration that our Black and Brown brothers and sisters were feeling when they saw what was happening at the Capitol? And do incidents like these set back the relationship between minorities and police? Mr. Davis, please go first.
I think if we're being honest, everybody that watched this saw two different responses, right? You saw a response, whether it was demonstrations in Baltimore following Freddie Gray, or Ferguson with Michael Brown, or even recently with George Floyd. That response looked starkly different than the response, or lack of response, we saw at the U.S. Capitol. And it confirmed something that the Kerner Commission said 54 years ago, that there's there are two Americas, one Black and one white, especially when it comes to the criminal justice system. So the first hard truth is that there was a different response. It does mean a lot, because it's a further affirmation to communities of color that, in fact, there is a different response. It exposed that the policing system we have is still being very much impacted by the ideological views of those who are working within it. In other words, if you share the views of certain people, you may be less fearful of them. And what they should have seen was just a riot, not a cause, a riot. And if police, when handling demonstrations, look at their job as to not to interpret or to judge the views of the people demonstrating, but to facilitate their First Amendment right, then it doesn't matter whether you're fighting for Black lives, or quite frankly, you could be the biggest racist in the world, you still have a right to exercise that First Amendment freedom, and should be treated with dignity and respect by the police until your behavior says otherwise. So I think that was one of those moments where it was just revealed that we still are very much impacted by structural racism, that this reaffirmed that there are two societies in many cases when it comes to communities of color, and that we need to have the courage and the wherewithal to call it like we see it so that we can fix it.
Mr. Adegbile?
Well, I think Ron covered it. I guess I would just add that there are two ways to think about it. The first is readiness and then response. And one of the ways to look at it is the way in which law enforcement prepared for marches that they knew were going to happen, for activity that they anticipated, and how it is they got ready for it, right? What type of resources did they deploy? How prepared were they based on the intelligence that they had? And I think that there was there are questions that are being asked, obviously nationally on the Hill. As I understand it, the acting chief of the Capitol Police apologized yesterday for the response of the Capitol Police in connection with the things that we saw earlier this month. And there were failures of readiness. There was information, there was intelligence that wasn't acted on. In contrast, we saw a very robust and aggressive deployment and readiness for some of the marches that were, by any measure, much more peaceful than what we saw with a democracy-threatening insurrection in the Capitol. And so that's the first point. And then the second point is that once it happened, and if you don't get ready, obviously it's difficult. It's difficult for the officers in place there to do what is necessary when you're being overrun by any measure was a mob, and there are real challenges. And we saw some of that on video. We saw many officers that were trying hard to hold the line, and some of whom were injured, some who were killed, which is sort of an astounding thing that in our democracy, as the wheels of democracy are spinning, officers were essentially executed by a mob. And part of the disparity is how that killing was responded to. We know that there is always concern when law enforcement in the line of duty is attacked, killed, injured. And it was an extraordinary event in the Capitol, and we all watched it from our living rooms, and it was very painful. And even the response, people who would be up in arms in many situations didn't have a lot to say about that fact. And so there is an accounting that needs to be done about what we saw in Washington, D.C., in our Capitol. Today, we heard that there are continuing threats, and that work is going to have to continue. It's a national issue, and it's an issue that the democracy requires that we get tighter on, and that we met out justice impartially. And as Ron said, not based on the views of the people expressed, but where you step over the line to commit crimes, where you organize for the purposes of committing crimes, we expect that public safety be maintained. And I don't think that is what we saw.
We also saw, speaking of seeing things, we also saw some police officers, what would appear, based on videos, being very sympathetic to some of these rioters and taking selfies with them. What kind of message does that send?
Let me add a couple things. That's the part where I think we're going to have to take a look at, once again, whether or not how we respond based on people's individual ideological views. Clearly, it sends the wrong message. I'm literally looking for the after action to see, a lot of off-duty officers and off-duty military were actually arrested there. And so one thing we've known for the last decade, I think that probably your own police department can tell you this, that FBI has made clear that there is an infiltration of white nationalism and white supremacists in law enforcement and the military. And so we have to ask why they would gravitate, what's the benefit of it, and how do we fight against it? And once again, all these things are coincide with the vast majority of cops who really want to do a good job, but they're just forced to work in a structural system that's flawed and to be surrounded by this. One thing I want to say that Debo mentioned, and to show you the different responses and why, as a proud law enforcement officer, I think my profession has to stand up and speak out more now than ever before. When President Obama said if he had a son, he would look like Trayvon Martin, people went ballistic, right? In other words, that's anti-police rhetoric. You're going to cause cops to die. When Mayor de Blasio, New York, was asking for police reform, they stood up and turned their backs on him at the funeral of officers because they said his anti-police rhetoric caused the officers to die. Here you got the President of the United States inciting an insurrection that has killed a cop, and I haven't heard a word come out yet from a police union saying that they're opposed to what he said he should be indicted. And so we have to start basically calling out hypocrisy when we see it. And we got to start making sure that the law enforcement profession earns the trust and respect that we so desperately want.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Adegbile, much of the conversation here in New London has centered around whether the city should have a police commission. Would you tell us about some of the national trends when it comes to community oversight of police?
So I think the key thing, and Ron spoke to this in his introductory remarks, one of the key things is that we're trying to establish a framework of trust, which will aid in legitimacy, which in turn will help public safety. That's the idea, that in order to do police work, in order to solve crimes, you need the participation of the community. Police officers are there to protect and serve the community. And so there needs to be a context. There needs to be an exchange. There needs to be a willingness to come forward and to support the efforts of law enforcement. And one of the ways in which many people are saying that we can move forward is to have greater dialogue, to have lines open so that the community has a stake. Of course, policing is a technical job, profession. It's one that requires training. Not every individual knows all of the tactics and issues that police officers have to focus on. And so to be sure, there are experts needed, and there are things that are of particular importance that require expertise. But so much of policing is interaction with the community. It's policing our neighborhoods. It's walking among us or driving among us. It's knowing how to develop leads and investigate crimes. And the models that are being talked about are structural ways to engage more effectively in dialogue in productive ways. And so there are a range of models that are being considered. The Conference of Mayors in its report suggested that dialogue and exchange is important. Our purpose here, or my purpose here today, is not to prescribe how a particular city proceeds, but that there need to be community voices and exchanges. I think every effective police chief and police leader will say that dialogue is invaluable and necessary to enhance public safety. And so the question is, how do we construct something that allows for that exchange to happen in productive ways? Ron has been engaged in this work for so many years, so I'm sure that he has perspectives on it.
Actually, I have another question for Mr. Davis. Can you talk about how the job has evolved, especially since police are expected to be first responders to every scene? And should they be?
I think the job is very complex now. And no, they shouldn't be. That's one of the bigger challenges is, I think, and this is the part where I think police we have a legitimate concern about the over-reliance on police to solve social problems. And so what has happened is over the last 20 or 30 years, we have deconstructed most of the social services capacity in our communities, whether it's mental health services, drug addiction services, reentry services, and that one 24-hour entity, the police, are there to just respond. And the only problem with that is that one, we're not trained to do that, even though we keep adding training. We're not social workers, and you should not turn us into them. And two, I think it criminalizes activities that should not be criminalized. Homelessness is not a crime. Addiction is not a crime. And so those kind of things, mental illness is not a crime. So that we need to get out of that business and be able to only be there when it's something for public safety. So here's the interesting thing about it. Most police will not disagree with that because they're the ones at 2 o'clock in the morning responding to this with no resources to refer to. I tell somebody it's really unfair to an officer. I look at it this way, is that there's no mental health services. The person that needs the mental health services has to wait 6 months to get an appointment. Then he or she doesn't have the capacity to get the medication that's needed. They go off of their medication, they go into crisis, right? They can't get appointments, they can't get treatment, they can't get medication. When they go into crisis, one of my 25-year-old cops now has to deal with them at 2 o'clock in the morning while they're holding a knife talking because they're in crisis. And then we second guess the officer making split-second decisions when everything else has failed. We as a community have failed. The systems have failed. So we need to take the officers out of that scenario and put social workers, mental health workers, and make sure the person doesn't go into crisis to begin with, and make sure we hold officers accountable that when they are needed, that they're still doing it the right way based on the behavior and based on using the least amount of force. So we definitely need to rethink. Some people are using the word reimagine, but reimagine what public safety looks like so that we have the proper role of police.
Right, thank you.
Could I just add one quick thought on this point, just very quickly?
Sure.
We talk so much about accountability of police officers, but what Ron just described is sort of a situation in which we've had a lack of accountability over long periods of time of our electeds and of the system to make sure that we are putting the first and best response forward rather than allowing the default because of a lack of attention to become law enforcement. You see? And so if we don't have the mechanisms in place and there is nobody else to call and we haven't attended to it, then when the train goes off the track, so to speak, who do we call? We call law enforcement, and then they're put in that situation, which is a very difficult situation. So I think the accountability discussion is vital here, but we have to have a holistic discussion of accountability. And that's part of what this issue of having the appropriate type of responders in different situations is about.
Izaskun, before you move on, I have to say this. The other area where I want communities to really pay attention to is crime reduction. And what I mean by that is when we expect the police to be responsible for reducing crime, then the only way they can do that is to take all of your resources, to consume most of the resources, and to use what tools they have. And it's the old phrase, if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And so the idea that a police chief is somehow going to get fired because the homicide rate didn't go down is almost begging for the response to be enforcement, aggressiveness, because that's the only thing he or she has. Crime reduction and public safety is the purview of the community, not the police departments, but one entity that should help. And so if crime goes up, then we have to deal with it. If it goes down, then we're successful. But when we allow the police to either take credit or take blame for a homicide rate, that's problematic. And a good example was Baltimore. And I have to say this, Baltimore, after Freddie Gray, the chief that came in to try to reform it was fired 6 months later because the mayor said the homicide rate didn't go down fast enough. Now this is in Baltimore with a 25% unemployment rate, with vacant houses, homelessness, addiction not being handled, and a high dropout rate, and you're telling the police chief you're fired because homicides didn't go down fast enough.
Okay, Ron, I want to squeeze so much more questions, and time is ticking. So I want to go to the next question. This is open to both of you, and since time is taken out, can we limit our responses to at least a minute each? And I know this is a loaded question. The question is for both Mr. Adegbile and Mr. Davis. The term defund the police means different things to different people. What does it mean to you? Mr. Davis, please go first.
Yeah, well, I hope it means what we talked about earlier, that there's a recognition that the law enforcement footprint is too large. And as a result, is taking finite resources that could go to the best responses to public safety. And so that as we basically start reallocating the responsibility of duties of work from the police to the community, that it would make sense that you would also then reallocate resources to support that. I hope, for those that say you should just arbitrarily cut it, I think there's a cautionary tone to that, because you still want services to work and be able to get a return on that investment before you start reducing the footprint. But it should mean that we should balance this thing out so that it's not all the resources to the police.
Mr. Adegbile?
Just very quickly, I'd say two things on this. One, I think the report that the commission did in New London captured a quote from Christy Lopez on this, and she sort of explains very well the range of views on it, and I would direct people to it. Their ranges of views on what defund the police means. It's like a Rorschach test. It means something different to everybody who looks at it. I think Ron has really captured what one of the meaningful definitions is, not the only one, but a very meaningful one. And I would just add that one of the ways to think about allocation of funding where resources are limited is to use data and to think about what are police being called to do? What type of data do you have about the reports? What are the emergency calls? How are you using the police force? What are they responding to? So you can determine, are the calls that they're being asked to respond to calls that are police-like calls in nature, or is there some other intervention or some other approach that would be more effective and not send people with a gun and the right to use deadly force to every incident? And that's a question, and it's observable through data if you have it and look at it.
Thank you. When we were still working in the office, the police scanner would be turned on and we could hear police chatter. Sometimes we would hear police pulling someone over because they, quote, fit the description, end quote. If you ask any Black or brown person, the description they fit is just based on their skin tone. And when this happens more than once to the same person, it could foster mistrust in police. So let's talk about training, in particular, training on anti-discrimination and cultural competency. Mr. Adegbile, how does it work? When should it start? And who monitors it to ensure that biases don't creep into the police department?
So training is a first piece, and obviously it begins, I think, when folks are going through the academy. You have to think about how you do it, right? Maybe it starts before that. You think about recruiting. What are the qualifications of people who you want to protect and serve and you want as police officers? How are you thinking about that? What is your theory of policing? Are you building a force that has the protect and serve mentality, or has there been a tradition of us and them, which may put things in a more hostile, antagonistic posture? So really begins with recruitment. Then you have the initial training for the rookies and the folks who are coming in. But any training is also going to be affected by the culture of the department and the accountability mechanisms. Police officers learn certainly from training, but they also learn a lot on the job, like everybody does in every job. And so you have to create a culture that honors and respects people. And obviously, part of the reason we talked about legitimacy and trust earlier is because ideally you want the people to respect law enforcement also. And if you start to circle the wagons and have an us and them mentality, if the police force is not connected to or knowledgeable of the community and feels like it's coming from remote places and policing a city but has no meaningful connection to it, you can get off on the wrong track. So it's a life cycle. Training is a moment in time, and it can't be one and done. It needs to be iterative, but you also need to have the accountability mechanisms, and not all the accountability mechanisms need to be extreme or firing or severe measures. There can be progressive discipline. There can be coaching. There can be things that are done to get people who may be off track on track with some interventions early. Too often what happens is that there are signs of trouble and there isn't accountability. And that's where we get into some of the more serious issues experience teaches.
This question is for Mr. Davis. The New London recommends that the city councilors be part of the contract negotiation team with the police union. Your national report also recommends that cities play a greater role in negotiations of collective bargaining agreements. Have other police departments nationwide starting doing this? And what happens when cities participate in collective bargaining agreements? Mr. Davis, I'm going to give you 2 minutes because I want to ask one more question before we have to move on to the panelists.
Well, real quick, the union comes up a lot, and people, to be very candid, people focus on the union as being a big obstacle. And I would say, actually, as a blue-collar worker, the union is there to support the rank and file. What can be the obstacle of the conditions that we agree to in a contract? So it's not the fact that someone has a union, it's what you're agreeing to. And so the more the cities understand or are involved in a contract negotiation, then you can get rid of those provisions or prevent those provisions that have nothing to do with working conditions and turn out to be simply obstructions to justice. Waiting 24 hours to interview somebody, and also to kill somebody, not being able to discipline somebody no matter what they did. There's certain things that, that we have given away over the last decade or so, and we monetized it. In other words, if you'll take a 5% reduction in pay, right, then we'll get rid of these things. And so we have to now understand that, the union contracts matter. Like you said, I don't think we should demonize the union, because the same way if I was an auto worker or anyone else, unions are basically the backbone of this country. They protect workers, and officers are workers like anyone else, and they deserve that protection. But you can't sell the shop. And it means that the city should be involved and protect against those provisions. And this report gives you some examples of the kind of provisions you should protect against to make sure that there's not an obstruction to justice. But also, this in closing real quick, I also tell community members, especially, elected leaders, is quit having false expectations for the union. They're there to represent the officers. They're not social justice advocates. They're not the police department. They don't speak for the police department. And so we get disappointed when they don't say things that we want them to say, but in many ways that's not why they're there. So the best way to hold them accountable is to make sure that the provisions take care of the workers without negotiating away the rights and the privilege of the community.
Okay, I'm going to have a final question, and it'll be for both panelists. And again, we have a couple minutes, 2 minutes each. Before I end every interview, I always ask, is there something I didn't ask you that you think I should know? So is there?
I think you asked in the amount of time you asked great questions. I would say this is, in having this discussion And I think it's a very tough discussion because we have not done something we have done as a country. We have not done our truth telling and reconciliation. We have a history in this country that we need to quit trying to rewrite or revise and accept that there was slavery, that there were Jim Crow laws, that the police department was used to enforce those laws and those institutions, that the many operating systems we have are still impacted by structural racism. And that's not the same thing as saying all cops are racist. And we should not allow the police to either accept that, believe that, or to espouse that. It is saying that under these systems that are so tainted that even good cops can have bad outcomes and bad cops get away with murder and operate with impunity. So anyway, in that sense, as we reform, the only thing I would ask communities to do is don't reform at the officers, make them a part of the reform because they're also stakeholders in that the better that they interact, the better they're held accountable, the safer they are, the safer you are. And if that means that you reduce the size of the department, reduce the footprint, it is what it is. But there's an opportunity right now to do, I would say, so that was the issue for me, is this making sure we just don't demonize the officers because they're not the only institution that needs this kind of change. We as a country, this is why it's so great when the president himself now has talked about structural racism. So maybe we can have an honest discussion beyond, as you're doing right now. And I think that's the only thing I would add. So thank you.
Mr. Adegbile?
I would just say that we periodically have these conversations in the country or city by city, and there's a focus, there's a burst, and then attention goes to a different issue. And I would say that folks speak about this summer and call it a reckoning, but it's only a reckoning if you actually address and deal with the thing that's in front of you. It's not a reckoning if you pass over it, you focus on it for a minute, and then you move on. And so what I would suggest is that we take up the charge you gave to us. This is hard work, but let's stay on it. Staying on it and improving the conversation, making some of the tough choices, maybe looking at some reallocation, but also support in the ways that law enforcement needs support to do a better job. It is the work that is going to lead to better public safety. And public safety is the goal. Public safety is the goal. And public safety will help both officers feel better and the community feel better. And you can achieve both things. I think it's a false narrative to think that that everybody has to be opposed and that it's us and them. There are commonalities and there are ways that we can do this to make our cities better. And New London can be one of the cities leading the way.
Thank you. I want to thank Mr. Adegbile and Mr. Davis for their participation in tonight's conversation. Very interesting. Before I move on to the next panelist, I want to acknowledge that police officers are special people who want to serve the community and are willing to risk their lives to protect others. But we are having this conversation today because when police departments don't hold their officers accountable or train them properly, it could cost lives. Dean McKnight, you were chair of the New London Public Safety Policy Review Committee. Across the country, there have been calls to abolish or defund the police. What was the approach or guiding principles you and the committee had when making recommendation about policing in New London?
Well, first of all, thank you, Sassy. Thank you to Debo and Ron for those very helpful overarching comments about policing around the country. We approached this as a listening opportunity initially. We had very well-organized young people, people of all ages really, but being driven by young people in New London who were very clear about what they wanted to see in terms of in their words, the abolition of policing or the defunding of policing. And so we started with that as our charge. Hey, let's unpack these terms. As you just said, it's really complicated. People use them in different ways. I work in education, and that's what I think I was able to bring is the awareness that sometimes things are easier to wrap your head around theoretically than they are in the practical sense. And so we were kind of experiencing a tension about, I think there was general agreement that what we need in this country is a totally new vision for how to keep our community safe. But until we can really develop that, what could we do in the meantime? And so that was the kind of starting point for our conversation about this project.
Thank you. Mr. Dominguez. The committee recommends establishing a civilian police review board. The review board, in contrast to the limited powers of the Police Community Relations Committee, could have subpoena powers to compel witnesses and provide for public presentation of evidence, along with the ability to review police department policies. As president of the council, what challenges do you foresee in establishing this review board? And how do you get city council and community buy-in?
Good evening. Thank you, Ms. Naraneta, and also I want to thank Mr. Debo and also Mr. Davis for their words and their insight on such an incredible topic that we're talking this evening. To my question, you know what? I believe that this could be done. A civilian commission board, we do need one. I think because of the atmosphere that we're living in right now, the tone of the country, something has to be done to show that we're moving forward. And when I say that, I mean it in seeing that we have had so much support in our city, starting from the young people. I believe this generation, the young generation, they have so much insight, they have the passion, and I think they have the ability to open the eyes of many of us. And I think, and it's all over our nation that has been happening. So I'm thankful for that. So I believe that we have the support, and also we also, as the city council president, I believe that the council that we have and during this time is very unique. We have our own strengths, and we have the ability to be able to make this possible. Are we going to have maybe some roadblocks? Possibly, but I think that we as a city council, we have the legislative body, and we're called to hear, right, the voice of the people, right? This government is of the people, for the people, and by the people. So,
what are the obstacles that you think?
well, some obstacles could be, for example, maybe, others who are against it, you know what I mean? And have their own point of view of looking at what a commission police board can do, and it could go both ways. It could be, it could be through false propaganda, because that's what happened in our nation. False propaganda moves on, and look what happened at the Capitol, an invasion at the Capitol. So that could be one. But coming from us, from the city council, I'm confident that for us to be able to pass it and have this in place, I don't think we have an issue. Because again, just to go back to your question, this was a recommendation that was brought by the police policy review board. And if it was brought by them, it's going to go to the mayor, then to us. So, and we're going to do what we can to make it possible.
Thank you. Ms. Lanier, the committee also recommends through a charter change to establish a police commission. The police commission will help guide hiring and firing decisions, along with other personnel-related matters, and work with the police union. Your report says it will take great, quote, political will, end quote, to establish the commission. Ms. Lanier, why is that? What obstacles, if any, do you foresee in establishing the commission? You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thanks. I think the first challenge is going to be the charter. And through our discussions, it was revealed that the charter has certain restrictions. One being that the decision-making that we wanted to extend to a police commission are at this point at the sole discretion of the mayor and the mayor's decision to make. And also, in order to give that commission the authority that it needs would require a revision. And Efrai can talk about that, but that is a very complex and complicated process. And it's something that won't happen overnight. But with that in mind, the committee recommended an alternative that we certainly proceed with the modifications of the charter, but create the framework for the commission, and that commission do the investigative work and report to the mayor, who would in turn make a decision. But once the revision happens, that commission would have the authority that we would want it to have. The other opposition that I see is just the opposition from officers who I assume would not like having that kind of oversight. And I'm not painting with a broad brush. And I am a 27-year veteran. I am a law enforcement officer as well, retired now. So I get that, but I'm saying for those few that that are a part of a competing culture in terms of the type of police department we would like to see, the type of police department that the city deserves. The accountability piece is new for them, and it's going to take an adjustment. And that adjustment won't be easy for those officers or the community. So we can anticipate some pushback, I would assume. I would hope not, because it's certainly in the best interest of not only the officers, but the community to have that level of accountability, because that knowing that accountability piece is there, I believe it is motivation to change behavior. So I see this commission as a plus for all, the city and the officers. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that I know that there are people in the police department that are going to oppose that and not feel comfortable with that. It's new, and the adjustment, I think, for some will be challenging.
Thank you. Captain Wright, this question's for you. The report says that the police department should reflect the community it serves, and they recommend recruiting residents from the New London community to join the department. What recruitment efforts are currently being done? And what are some of the challenges to recruiting minority police officers?
I think it's difficult, it's complicated. A better job can be done. Recently, in our latest recruitment process, we organized and orchestrated our own testing process. We held it within the city. Purpose was behind that was to make it closer to home for our residents and nearby residents. We waived all fees associated with the testing process. We tried to reduce the time frame of it so that individuals wouldn't have to come back and forth or lose work or days off at their current jobs. And I think it's important that we're also looking at a mentoring program where prior to the process or opening of a process, there's the interaction between law enforcement and officers and the community members to try to cultivate that interest in the profession and to give them insight to what the process consists of. For so many years, decades, people of color or minority individuals haven't had the insight. They haven't had an uncle, brother, cousin, mother, father on the job per se. So the insight to the process and what it consists of has not always been there. But by doing
and inequality,
a mentoring program, you could give individuals that insight. So when the testing comes about, they're better prepared. They know what to expect. So it's not a surprise. And I think that would increase the numbers or the higher scores, which would make more individuals eligible for it. And I think that would draw interest.
So with this mentoring program, how does that work? I mean, are you going into the community itself, or is when an officer expresses interest, a candidate expresses interest?
Oh, I think in order for it to work, you have to be proactive. You just can't stand by and wait for someone to show interest. You have to actively go out and engage and interact with individuals, starting as soon as high school and sometimes interest in middle school, and just cultivate it and have, greater dialogue, active participation, going to those events, going to community agencies, the churches, and just having that general conversation. Hey, have you ever thought about this? Or, there's different things that are applicable to do. And I think once you start to draw that interest, or all it takes is that one conversation to say, okay, I might try it out. And then having events where they can prep for the physical agility aspect of it, the oral board aspect of it, teaching them about, things that are going to be looked at so they can start to prepare and become eligible for it. I think that's so important. And if more people had that opportunity and didn't have to have a family member already in the profession in order to get that insight, I think it'd be invaluable.
What are you hearing any negative feedback, let's say from a person of color saying, why would I join the police department if they targeted us disproportionately? Have you
Oh,
heard
absolutely.
of
That conversation always happens. And, my immediate response is it's be the change, be the individual that you can work to address that from the inside versus the outside. Be what you want to see. And hopefully that draws interest. And once you get enough individuals who are working towards the same goal and want to better their community, give back to their community, I think it trickles down and it becomes infectious in the good way.
Thank you. The report recommends taking a holistic approach to budgeting. And while it's not outright calling for a reduction in the police budget, it is suggesting that the mayor and city council make every effort to redirect funding to schools and social services. Ms. Milstein, as Director of Human Services, how do you hope to expand the working relationship between your department and the police? What policies or services would you like to see instituted?
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank everyone on this panel as well for all the work that you do, and to Dean McKnight for your vision, ability to bring people together, and recommendations that came out of the committee. First, I'd like to say that data, we talked about data earlier. 40% of all police calls are regarding mental health.
In New London?
In New London, that is correct. And I want to first state by saying that a mental health condition is a disease. It is not a moral failing. It is not a character flaw. It is a disease like asthma or diabetes. That is the same with substance use disorder. It is a D. So we've got to deal with that stigma right away. So now we have police officers who are asked to intervene because when a family doesn't know what to do, or a neighbor doesn't know what to do when a person is in crisis, they call 911. And we in New London have had for 20 years a partnership with the State Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, where we have trained crisis intervention officers who work with police. We also have a mobile outreach program that provides emergency support for individuals. What we have learned through a very successful initiative that we have in New London that was implemented to battle the opioid crisis is that people need much more than just a one-time intervention, or more than just going to different services in the community. We have implemented a program with recovery navigators. Our recovery navigators are people with lived experience who work with individuals who have opioid use disorder. And the most important part of this initiative is that there is a caring, consistent relationship that is developed. It is a harm reduction model. So today, a person in crisis might need help getting food. They might need help navigating a system, the healthcare system. Our navigators are there every step of the way. We are getting people food. During the COVID crisis now, our navigators are making sure that people get personal protective equipment. We can build on this model. We have partnered with our fire department as our first responders, and it's been a very, very beneficial partnership. We have worked with the police on many of these cases. I would like to see this model expanded, and we build on what we have and then expand it to the navigator model.
So talk a little bit more about that expansion. How would it look like to you if you got all the funding was in place? How would it look like to you?
We would have a strong partnership, as we do already, with the police department. And I would start by identifying those individuals, our neighbors in our community, who have frequent contact with the police. And then we take a holistic approach. We find out what that person needs. It's a well-being, public health framework. And then we build supports and services around what that individual needs. We work with the state, the crisis intervention folks, the emergency mobile outreach people. And then what our navigators do as well, they help people with jobs, they help them with housing. And we have community care teams in place where we follow up on what needs to be done for that individual. So we have it in place. It's just a question of more resources to expand it. I would like to see all the officers trained in crisis intervention. And when we talk about training, I'd like to make this point. Training is only as good as the implementation of the training. So officers, social workers, anyone involved need to be well supported, they need to be well supervised, and there need to be robust systems of quality improvement that are in place. I would like to see if we're able to build on and expand our models, that we have a community advisory committee, people with lived experience, people who represent the diversity of our community, making sure that we're keeping up with science, with evidence-based practices.
Thank you. This question is for Ms. Shepard. The report says it's critical for police to gain the public's trust. From your experience, how does the community view police? And what steps do you think they can make to gain the public's trust? And what role do you see young people playing in this?
Thank you for that question. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. How does the community see police? I would really echo what Mr. Davis said earlier, right, around relationship and the relationship being non-existent, right? Like there are many instances, and I really want to ground this conversation in the thought that New London is immune to what's happening on the national level, right? Like there are examples of profiling, there are examples of brutality, there are examples in some case death in New London, right? At the hands of interactions with police. So young people especially, right, like that is what they know. That is the relationship that has been founded. And so that's what we're working with. And in terms of what police can do to improve, I think it's listen. I think it's honor the asks of young people, which is to think about what it looks like to adequately fund their education, right? Think about what it looks like to adequately fund our communities, like holistically, as we keep saying, right? And to not criminalize, to not target young people. Because that is the birth of the mistrust that exists between community. It's the violation of community trust that exists in New London. And I say that to say that, yeah, young people have been very clear. And this is not, although these demands were presented last summer, the ideas were not new. The ideas that young people are saying, hey, like, I don't have textbooks, right? Like, I don't have food security. I don't have home security, right? Like, these are not new things. People are struggling and have been. And so what role is policing doing to solve that? And the answer is, I don't think there is one, right? I think it's like, as people have said, it's the role of community. So police can listen, right? But I think it's more about what can community do? As was said, right? It is our community's responsibility to support each other. What does it look like for us to think of when we talk about defunding, when we talk about divest and investing in community holistically? We're talking about what does it look like for community to take responsibility for each other? And I really, I've been thinking about the reasons why we turn to police to begin with, and I've kind of narrowed it down to a few things around like conflict, crisis, and crime, right? We as human beings really have to dig into and figure out new ways to be in conflict with each other so that we're not relying on policing to figure that out, right? Yeah.
So you said one way to gain trust is by listening. Mm-hmm. There has to be more. What else?
Yeah. I think it's acknowledging the harm that's been done. I think the continuation, like to deny or to ignore, will only breed more mistrust.
Thank you. And speaking of trust, the report was critical of the inappropriate use of social media by the police union and of individual officers. Your report goes on to say, quote, "It will be impossible for police to develop a trusting relationship with the community if this kind of behavior continues and becomes endemic to police culture in New London," end quote. This question is open to all the panelists. What should be done?
I'm happy to take a shot at this.
Sure.
You know, I was really disgusted when I learned about what was happening on the police union website. And the easiest thing to do is to hide behind the First Amendment, freedom of speech, which we all have as individuals, as citizens. But I think public servants should, in fact, be held to a different and higher standard when it comes to how you interact with the community that you're expected to protect and serve. And so I've been unequivocal in my statement about this. I think it is unacceptable. You know, again, I think Mr. Davis made a really important point, which is we need to be more realistic about the role of unions, what they're here to do. They're not social justice warriors. I think if we could, you know, historicize the issues around policing and have police understand that on a more fundamental level, then maybe they could move more in the direction of being more thoughtful and being more interested in kind of a more equitable way to police communities. But until that happens, I don't want to set unfair expectations. But to me, it's not unfair to expect that the people who are protecting and serving are not going to use their personal social media or any sort of union website to be able to target or bully or harass citizens. It's threatening. As a Black man myself, I have had really tense encounters and interactions, not necessarily just here in New London. I've lived a lot of different places. And you know, to imagine my photo on the page of a police officer union, I would see that as threatening, hostile, and intimidating, and I think it's completely uncalled for.
I thought I saw Mr. Davis raise his hand.
Yeah, just one thing, once again, with the union and the accountability. First thing, in most cities, and I can't speak for New London, so I apologize for that, but always remember that just because the union does not always represent the views of the rank and file. And when selecting union leadership, in many cases, officers are not looking for moral leadership. They're looking for things like pay raises and discipline negotiations. And so what I think has to happen is that the way to change the union is to change that those who get involved in the union and to get to the individual officers. The question I would have is not what the union is posting on a website. That's obviously bad by itself. But what's the response of the officers that are members of that union? What's the response of the rank and file? Why are they should be demanding something that brings them into disrepute to be taken down. So that's the bigger issue. It's almost like we talked about before. It's if you're silenced, then as you always said, there's only two things that are only two forms of protest that are unacceptable: violence and silence. And so silence is complicity. So the question would be, is why there's not uproar inside the department would be the number one question I would have had if I was the chief.
Again, this is to, I wanted to bring back Mr. Adegbile and Mr. Davis to this conversation again. For the U.S. Mayor's Conference report, what trends are you seeing that are from the recommendations that are actually being followed through?
Ron, I'll start and then you can jump in. So we've seen lots of cities that are taking up at least pieces of the recommendations. Obviously, the Conference of Mayors can speak for itself, but I sort of see this as a moment in which the largest cities in the nation have come together and unanimously adopted a set of pillars or foundational pieces that can be the cornerstones of building a different relationship, having the type of reset that we've talked about. It's going to be different in each and every place. It's not a paint by numbers where you can just take everything and throw it in any jurisdiction. There are size issues, there are resource issues, there are a number of different things. But what we're seeing is that people are looking at the recommendations and they are considering which pieces of these recommendations have they already moved on and which haven't they moved on. And I think that this process is something that is a tool both for the mayors and the political leaders to put down a flag and say, okay, we have a role, we have to be accountable and not just trade off various things that make accountability impossible because we don't have the budgetary resources or we don't want to address the hard problems. So we're going to leave it to the police to figure out when folks call 911. The report is designed to create a different conversation about accountability, not just on the part of police, but for the community, for the elected leaders that are sent there by the community, and for the law enforcement officers. And we are seeing in different places, in cities in Ohio, and some in the western part of the United States, jurisdictions that are picking up pieces of this and trying to move forward with it, including some of the mayors that were on the subcommittee. Mayor Cranley, I think, in Ohio has taken up, in Cincinnati has taken up pieces of this and is trying to advance it. So we have to look at these things, but the work you're doing here is an example, right? Ask the hard questions, figure out what you've done, and figure out what else you can do and commit to it.
Just real quick on this one, it's, just keep in mind, like law enforcement, there's 16 to 18,000 different local, state, and tribal law enforcement agencies in the United States, which means there's 16 to 18,000 local communities. The vast majority, believe it or not, are the size of New London. We always focus on the Chicagos and the LAs, but that's not the heart and soul of what makes the country. And so the idea that we could come together and start identifying best practices so that we learn from the successes of New London, can also learn from the setbacks in Chicago. And Ms. Shepherd said it best, is that, you know, the ability for communities to listen and to be able to apply that is probably smart. So I think the beautiful thing with this is it recognizes that there's local communities, and it may start setting some national standards or best practices, evidence-based standards. Ms. Milstein said is you need some evidence-based standards that people can embrace and be held accountable to. And it doesn't make a difference. You know, you can't duck and dodge. It used to be smaller cities could hide from it. They're not part of the national discourse, as Ms. Shepherd said. But if you look at some of these tragedies, they're in big cities, they're in small cities. Ferguson thought that before Michael Brown. And so I think I applaud you guys in taking it on and having the courage to do that and taking on issues, because there's no community too small or too big for what you're doing. So I think that's the beauty of this report. It should be a foundational report, as well as yours will be for other communities.
This question is, before I move on to, we did get some questions from the public, but before we address some of those, my question is to everyone, what's next? Who wants to go first? What do you hope to happen next?
I'll take that one. I'll start off by saying I think it has to be continued effort on everyone's part. Some of the panelists hit upon some very key notes and points, but I think what's most important is open-mindedness. Most times individuals listen to respond versus listen to understand. And I think if everyone takes on that point of view, to hear and to understand, and as Ms. Shepherd said, acknowledge and not deny, I think we can move forward. By no means is this a sprint. It's going to be a marathon, but we have to actively participate and continue to progress rather than just getting to a point where we become accepting of the status quo.
From my perspective, if policymakers in the city and the community embrace the idea of this model of building on what we have, expanding it, changing it, then I would like to get moving to see how we can implement it. And again, a community advisory committee, many different partners. I mean, I'd like to get started, at 8:01 tonight.
I think just procedurally, as Council President already mentioned, the mayor has, shared the recommendations with City Council, and I'm sure, are taking up the recommendations one by one. So in terms of getting things done, I hope that that's the next step. What I will say is, being a part of a pretty big, entity in New London, which is folks who are in education, I think there's more we can contribute to this picture of holistic kind of public safety. I think there's research and development that can help us develop new ideas and approaches. You know, the traditional forms of bias training we saw through this process are not necessarily empirically shown to produce the kind of results that people need. And I think pointing back to the insurrection on January 6th, we can see in that example, people actually do know how to, remain composed under certain circumstances that are actually pretty threatening. So it's not necessarily about de-escalation and those things. I think that we need to develop a much more robust approach to an education that isn't a training. It is about historicizing, as Mr. Davis said, going back to the origins of this nation and how policing has been used to control and enslave particular groups of people. I think until we can provide that in-depth education, not only to police, but to citizens at large, then I don't think we're going to make it very far in our attempts to reform policing. So I'd like to see the colleges in the area kind of play a role in helping with that educational project.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Tammy. No, go.
One of the things that I think we also need to look at in terms of next steps, we're at really a very pivotal moment with not only the police accountability legislation that was passed statewide, and also looking at the George Floyd justice and policing legislation that very likely will pass now that the Democrats control the Senate. But these pieces of legislation have very reformative components that will change the way we think about policing, the way we do business. And so one of the things that I think, and I'm not going to get into all of what it says, it's very comprehensive, but one of the things that it talks about is addressing the discrimination. And that's one thing that I think we have yet to have that conversation about the racism that's embedded in police departments. And for years, people of color have talked about the aggressive policing, the disparate treatment, the bias in policing, the racial profiling, the excessive use of force, the deadly use of force. And then when we link that to what we witnessed a couple of weeks ago with white supremacists embedded in these incidents of police violence, we have never really had that conversation about the type of officers that are on the police force and how do we deal with this. And people are quick to talk about training, but I am of the belief that there's certain officers that training is not going to fix. And how do we deal with that? So for me personally, I believe that the real reform is coming, but in the interim, we really need to talk about the discrimination in policing and the impact that that has in the communities.
Efrai, I think you wanted to say something?
Yes, thank you so much, Ms. Lara. Thank you. Just to what's next, I think, we have to continue these dialogues. I think it's important, and just being honest and open. I'll tell you this, last year, before this started, we were having a public safety committee meeting. And in that meeting, there was a question asked to the chief. And after his response, I understood for the first time, which I never knew, that police departments don't have annual evaluations for their officers. Now, I'm coming from education. As a teacher, we get evaluated. I've been teaching for 23 years. So evaluations are not to harm you or to punish you. They're to make you better. So I think, first of all, we have to really come to these truths that, we have made mistakes in the past, and we have to come to the table allowing young people to hear their voices and make changes that are going to better our officers, and of course remove those that are not there. But the other thing I want to touch on that Mr. Davis covered is, what is the role of a police officer? Okay, we can't forget what our role is. Everyone's role. They're to protect and serve. They're not to be social workers. They're not to be mental health advisors or counselors. So we have to look at all those things. But of course, we need to make some changes. We need to make changes. But I think everyone, both sides, we need to agree to come together and talk about these solutions. What solutions can we bring? We can't come to the table with our hands already wrapped up and I'm not gonna change. Then if you're not gonna change, you're gonna have to be removed. Because the time is for us to move forward and to make sure that if we wanna live in the best community and have the best public safety, then both sides have to come together and talk about it. And I think, you know what, I think those are the next steps, and we have these recommendations that are coming, and our counselors are able and are ready to do what we have to do, because it's the voice of the people and it's the voice of this committee that was recommended by the mayor that we're going to be listening to.
I want to now phase into some questions we got from the public. So this is directed again to all the panelists. This question was submitted by Linda Heller. My question is, in terms of accountability, who is checking to see if anybody in policing has any background material on whether individual police have been involved in the white supremacy movement?
I'll start with that one if you don't mind.
Sure.
Well, and I won't speak for New London, but in general, there's the hiring process is primarily where most of the background investigation is done. I think what January 6th may have exposed is that there may be need to do updates along the way. Most departments don't do updates. You may do another background. When I became a police chief and get hired, you do another background. But it's maybe a job change or a department change. But if you stay in the same department for 20 years, no one may, if it doesn't come up through a complaint, people may not know, which is interesting because even the federal government now with top secret clearances make you reevaluate you every 5 years. So there may have to be, as we move forward, to make sure that we're checking for people that they're not engaged in sedition and insurrection. On top of it too would also be making sure people are also psychologically well, right? In other words, also safety and wellness to make sure that they're okay. Not for removal, but for services, right? This is a stressful job. And if you, they say hurt people, and that would include cops. So to make sure that they're okay, to take care of their well-being, but to also make sure that you don't have someone tainting the work of a department because they have these ideological views that are just counter to the community they're serving. I think we're going to reevaluate that. Unless New London is doing something different, it usually stops after hiring.
Captain Wright, do you want to address that?
Certainly, thank you. In regards, as the gentleman just said, normally the background checks and all that's covered in the initial hiring of an officer, and unless they're going to a task force or something along those lines, it remains status quo. That would probably be a very good adage to it. Now with the Connecticut's accountability legislation, officers will have to go periodic psychological evaluations, as well as drug testing and things of that nature. And I think the increased scrutiny can only make things better for the officers, the agency, and more importantly, the citizens in which we serve.
Could I just add that one of the things that grew out of the Capitol incident were some of the reports of the Black officers in the Capitol Police Department that were talking about the treatment they faced and how the cautions that they were sending up were not adequately responded to in terms of the way they were being treated by their fellow officers. And these are some of the indicia of problems where you have racial tension within the force itself. These are things that need to be treated seriously because they can be indicative of some larger problem, right? If there is racial hostility being directed at people that wear the badge and gun and that you depend upon to discharge your duties with, and that you may need to rely upon in a tough situation, certainly the public that's coming in and out is not going to be treated fairly. Now, I don't mean to suggest that everybody in the Capitol Police Department is harboring these views, but there seems to be reports that there were patterns of not attending to some of these things. and they were allowed to fester. And so it comes back to the points we've been talking about of telling the truth, of reckoning, of addressing these things, and of not accepting them. They can't be the default. You can't turn a blind eye to them, because when you do turn a blind eye, that's when you're waiting and cultivating the tragedy. And we can't do that.
This question is from Susan Anslin Connolly. If we are talking about evaluating police, what is wrong with accreditation?
I'm going to come in there. When I was in a cop's office, we tried. I mean, I think one of the things that we need to do with policing is it needs to evolve from being a vocation and a trade to a profession. And like any profession, we should be adhering to a body of knowledge based on evidence and science. For the attorneys on the panel, if you didn't know your information and your client lost because of that, you would get disbarred. If a doctor makes a mistake and does harm, they lose their license. As a police chief, I could be about as ignorant as I want to be and not lose my certification, because in many states there is none. And so we need to have accreditation so that departments have made a national body of standards that individuals can not only be certified, but they can be decertified when they no longer live up to the expectations of the profession. That's the next evolution for policing, is to be a widely respected profession and quit acting like 18 individual agencies that have no accountability to anybody other than the local community.
Brian, Captain Wright, any thoughts on that?
Sorry about that. I'm not too tech savvy, but I would say I would be in agreement. Part of Connecticut accountability is that in the next 5 years, all departments have to be CALIA certified and accredited. Currently, we're Tier 1 state certified, and I think it improves the standards because it has a lot to do with the rules and regs, and more importantly, the policies, which cover a broader area, and also it helps with the transparency to the community. It's important that the community knows the policies of a respective department and has access to them. It really doesn't do us too good to have a book full of policies which no one knows about, but making those policies available so someone can look, and as for, in addition to the complaint process, so someone knows what the process consists of and how to go about it, and making these things available so you don't necessarily have to come to the police department if you feel uncomfortable. You can get them online or from secondary or satellite locations. I think that helps, and it allows for that dialogue and also that increased interaction.
The next question is from Irene Weiss. Apparently, there are very few mental health professionals available for either police officer evaluation or for 211 type calls. The holistic approach is great, but how do we sell this to the taxpayers who must fund it?
Well, I think that this is a public health, public safety model. And I think if we do appropriate interventions, appropriate kinds of treatment and support, in the long run, taxpayers will save a lot of money because we won't have people involved with the system. And you know, we've had an initiative in New London for 5 years now, where there's a partnership between the city and our fire department. And we started 5 years ago because there were a lot of transports to the emergency room, not just people with mental health issues, substance use disorder, but senior citizens who were falling a lot. And we have a triage system in place, and we've reduced frequent transports to the emergency room by almost 75%. And an ambulance call costs the taxpayers about $600. So when you do the math, I mean, I think that's the argument for the taxpayers. I mean, it's about health, safety, and well-being, but it's also about money saved.
Dean McKnight, I see your hands raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring back what I thought was one of the most profound comments tonight from Maya, Ms. Shepherd, around like, why are police called? The conflict, crisis, and crime. I think that was a profound insight. And to connect it to what I hear Jeannie saying about sort of a more preventive model, I think that so much of what we're talking about is a shift from being reactive to proactive, right? From, even as early as K through 12, providing the kind of adequate education, providing the kind of, mental health support from a very young age through the schools, right? So again, it's sort of front loading taxpayer dollars into these other spaces where we can be teaching, what do you do when you're in conflict? What do healthy relationships look like? It might seem like a kumbaya thing to say, but I think Maya is so on point with this. If you can shift from, having to rely upon police to really kind of front loading all of the investment into these other spaces, very, very young ages, I think that would be money well spent. And it really mirrors the public health approach. If you eat an apple a day, they say, right? Or whatever it is, if you drink your water, then you don't have to end up with those incredibly, large medical bills later in life. So I think if we apply that same logic here, there's a lot of potential there.
With
I
one
want to circle
caveat,
back. I'm sorry.
this one caveat I would just for any community is, as we transfer the responsibility to the appropriate institutions, never forget the issue of structural racism exists within those same institutions. And so you want to make sure that you're still addressing these disparities in those systems so that you're not just delaying impact, but you're actually making a positive outcome. And I think President Dominguez is probably like in education, the biases of teachers or whether or not students of color go to special ed or not, all the things that you're struggling with doesn't go away because the police no longer go there. And we don't want to create an environment where you're just transferring one discriminatory practice to another agency.
I want to circle back to Ms. Shepard. She was talking about the interaction between police and young people. What would you like to see that interaction be?
I think I would like to see that interaction be designed by young people, right? I think I can make ideas of what I think it would be, but I think right now what the desire is to be removed, right? Removed from schools, right? Not to be brought in and present as a place of like punishment, right? As an entity of punishment. So that's my immediate answer. And I think that, when we think about, that's why this conversation, I'm glad we're having it. And like, I will always revert back to listening to young people because they have laid out pretty clearly, like, I don't want cops in my school, right? And so I think it's about, the interaction really needs to be about who do you want to see in place, and not like, what do you want to see cops do?
I have one final question from the public. It was on Facebook Live, and it said here, do police unions cover up for bad cops? What roles do you see that in police unions having or not having?
This is Ron. I don't think they cover up for it. I think in defending them and some of the provisions that we've allowed to exist, it empowers the continuation of the behavior that's problematic to begin with. Once again, I think it's hard for a union to cover up because they're not responsible for the investigation of, let's say, of officer-involved shooting. They're not responsible for the discipline. So I would look at it more as is the union aligned with regard to making sure the processes are there to reinforce positive behavior, but not protect negative behavior. So to me, it's more about not cover up. It is, are they protecting and preventing the accountability from occurring, right? I think cover up is probably more department-based for an agency that has those problems than it is union-based. But as the union, through their provisions, are they either intentionally or inadvertently protecting cops that just should not be there? That the ones that everyone knows just shouldn't be there, and are they protecting them, or are they basically doing the job they're supposed to do?
And I guess I have one more final question.
Can I just add one thing?
Sure.
I just want to say one thing because I think this is a piece that has been missed in terms of the new legislation. Many of the discussions is how the cities are virtually hamstringed in a sense that when you have a bad actor on the police department, and because of the advocacy of the union, and the labor boards. The cities are placed in positions where they're virtually powerless to do the kind of change work that we're talking about here tonight. And so I think on the statewide level, we need to look at that and to see how that we can create a system that is about labor law and labor practices and truth and fairness in terms of adherence to policies and procedures, and not about and the unions abusing their authority, abusing their office to burden a city with complaints and, in a sense, basically harassing the city with process. And so that is done in a way to, again, hamstring the city so that they can't be effective, so chiefs can't be effective, so mayors can't be effective, because it's an abuse of their office and an abusive process. And we have to get a handle on that.
This was certainly an enlightening conversation that we had today. I want to thank today's panelists for taking time out of their day to participate in tonight's discussion. I want to leave you all with a quote from cultural anthropologist, the late, great Margaret Mead. Quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has," end quote. Thank you all. Good night and stay safe.
Good night.